Red is on? Red is on.
He's the nicest man, Jerry. It's so nice.
Okay. All right, thank you. All right.
Mike was? Interesting. We're actually only down one, which is apparently Louis. Otherwise, full house.
Welcome to the July 11th, 2018 meeting of the Plan Commission of the City of Lake Forest. First, I'd like to introduce two new commission members who are kind enough to give us their time. Remy Piketty, Remo
Ramo
Piketty.
Piketty.
Thank
It is
you. I
not
will
an easy
learn.
one, so no problem.
And Commissioner Piketty has served previously on the City of Lake Forest Park and Recreation Board and also on the Gorton Community Center Board of Directors, so very experienced, and we appreciate him continuing to donate his time for the City of Lake Forest. And we also have Susan Athenson. Commissioner Athenson is well-known in the community for her incredible involvement in the schools in the City of Lake Forest. She has also been a Building Review Board member and also on the Historic Preservation Committee. And I should note, she's a sixth-generation citizen of Lake Forest. So we welcome both Commissioner Piketty and Commissioner Athenson.
Thank
Thank you
you.
both. Our first item of business is to have each commissioner please introduce themselves to the audience. We'll start with Commissioner Athenson, please.
Hi, Susan Athenson.
Michael Freeman.
Guy Berg.
Monica Ruggles.
Ramo Piketty.
And our next item of business is a very pleasant one, to recognize the past Plan Commission Chairman, Michael Lay, whom I've watched over the last 3 years perform very admirably as chairman, maintaining civility in the meetings and encouraging participation from many members of the community. Michael Lay was a member of the Plan Commission from May 2012 to January 2013, and he became chairman in February 2013 and just ended in May of 2018. During that time, he's been involved in over 20 major commission decisions, including Northwestern Lake Forest Hospital, the new construction, the Woodland Academy Master Plan, the Bicycle Master Plan, Amberley Woods Commercial Site Development, Oak Knoll Woodlands, Laurel and Western Avenues redevelopment, condo development and approval of McKinley and Wisconsin Avenue, the waterway gas and wash discussions, McKinley Road redevelopment, and Saunders Road subdivision, just to name a selection from a long list. He was also involved in a number of code updates and discussions. So we also understand that Chairman Lay also served on the board of Gorton. So here again, we have a very thoughtful and generous citizen giving his volunteer time to the community. Michael, we have a small plaque to present to you in appreciation for your service.
To Susan and Ramo, I really, I think you're going to enjoy your time on the commission. It's a very challenging assignment in terms of city government. I'm sure you're going to find, although Susan, you're probably familiar with that from the disputes that you saw for the board you sat on. But to Rosemary and Michael and Guy and Monica, I really want to say thank you for both, A, inviting me here this evening, and for the recognition. This is very, very nice. You know, this commission is really, in my mind, probably next to the council, the cusp of where a lot of controversy can erupt and a lot of clashes can occur. But and that's because of three things. Number one, you've got three competing interests oftentimes to serve. Number one, you've got the petitioner, or you've got the nearby residents, and then third, you've got the city interest as a whole. And the one thing I found that really served me well was really honing the ability to listen, because today's day and age, the public, I found, at least here in Lake Forest, was more concerned about being heard and that their voice is being listened to and how that affected the outcome of decisions. Even though the decisions might not have gone petitioner's way or city interest as a whole or whatever, didn't go their particular way, I found it encouraging after one of those occurrences where the interests really clashed, people coming up and saying, hey, it didn't go the way I wanted, but at least we felt we got a good, we were heard, and that we got a piece of what we were after. So best of luck to you. I know you'll continue to do well, and we'll probably see you around town. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And before continuing with our next business, I want to indicate that Kathy Cerniak, the Director of Development, is here representing the city, and I am Rosemary Kerr. All right, our first item on the agenda is consideration of approval of the minutes of the April 11th, 2018 Plan Commission meeting. I'm going to keep that separate, I think, from the May 9th, because we've had turnover in the commissioners. So may I ask for a motion to approve consideration of the minutes of the April 11th, 2018 Plan Commission meeting?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Anyone have any comments on the minutes?
Nope.
Seeing none, all those in favor of approving the minutes, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
The motion is carried. And now we move to the May 9th, 2018 Plan Commission meeting minutes. And Commissioner Piketty and Commissioner Athenson were not on the board at the time. Commissioners, do you plan to vote on the minutes, or will you vote present?
I'll vote present.
Yes, I will abstain from voting. Yeah.
Okay. So we have 4 remaining commissioners, which should still give us a quorum.
And the entire meeting was 10 minutes long or something like that, so I think that was quite a difference for Kathy typing those up as opposed to the one before. So I'll make a motion to approve the minutes as submitted.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor of approving the minutes from the May 9th, 2018 Plan Commission meeting, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
The motion is carried. We have one item on the agenda tonight for public hearing and action. Consideration of amendments relating to small wireless facilities. Amendments are proposed to Chapter 159 zoning and Chapter 98 streets and sidewalks. The City Council directed the Plan Commission to conduct a public hearing on the proposed amendments in response to recent legislation. We don't have a petitioner as such this evening. The presentation will be made by city staff.
Thank you, Chairman Kerr. This matter was directed to the Plan Commission by the City Council. I will note that former Chairman Lay mentioned that this commission does a lot of exciting things. This probably isn't one of the more exciting things. During the past legislative session, there was a lot of discussion about small wireless facilities. That is, facilities that can be co-located on existing utility poles, on existing structures that are in non-residential areas. And as that discussion was moving through the legislature, the Illinois Municipal League reached out to municipalities really to be proactive, and held a number of meetings, brought in attorneys from various municipalities, and worked through drafts of an ordinance in anticipation of the legislature essentially preempting municipalities' ability to regulate small cell wireless facilities from a zoning perspective. What is interesting is that in years past, as this Plan Commission and a separate task force discussed telecommunication facilities, they really wanted us to push telecommunication providers in the direction of using small cell installations, distributed antennas that are at a lower level, and we've really pushed back and in fact haven't approved some fairly recent requests for new towers, telecommunication towers. So this is a direction that the City of Lake Forest wanted to move in. I did include the Public Act, not expecting you to read the whole thing, although probably some of you did, but really more as information. What the legislation did, again, was to preempt municipalities' ability to regulate these facilities, micro and small wireless facilities, from a zoning perspective. They are considered permitted. The act does allow the municipalities to put in place administrative regulations. And that's what the Illinois Municipal League put together, was essentially a model ordinance, which we used as a framework, changing very few words, to really establish some regulation to the extent allowed by the Public Act. The regulation speaks to height, for instance, speaks to some design features. But importantly, this establishes a permitting process. As of August 1st, if we don't have something in place, wireless companies can essentially come in and without a permit begin to install these facilities. So the ordinance as proposed outlines submittal requirements, the kind of materials that we would require for any type of permitting, site plans, location, information on size and shape, and it allows us to charge a fee for processing those. So it really is legislation that we could choose to do nothing, or we could choose to regulate within the limitations allowed by the legislature and get something in place. If you choose to move forward with this, we actually tentatively have it scheduled on Monday night City Council meeting, simply so we can have something in place. I don't expect the wireless companies to be rushing in. We've been advised to have it in place, but again, in our discussions with wireless companies, we've been encouraging them to take this approach for probably the last 8 years. And there is a cost involved, there's an investment, but with this in place, our sense is that it will give us even more leverage to say, no more large new towers. I think we were talking about one out near Waukegan and Everett Road at one point, and there was no good location. This will really allow us to say, prove to us that you can't do something lower. So with that, I wasn't going to walk through the entire ordinance word for word, but if you have specific questions, I can certainly address this. But unlike many petitions that come before you, this is really, we're doing this because this is what the legislature has said that we can regulate, and it seems better to do that than not to do that. So I'd be happy to try and answer any questions you have.
Well, before opening up to questions, we should ask if there are any conflicts of interest or ex parte contacts on behalf of any of the commissioners?
No.
Okay. Hearing none, I would like to adopt what other commissions have been doing to encourage communication and questioning from each commissioner, with starting a round of questions where I would call on each commissioner individually, and then after that, open it up to all commissioners with any additional questions they may have. And I will certainly try and do that in a round-robin fashion each meeting so that everyone gets a turn to be first, middle, and last. I'm going to start with Commissioner Ruggles. Do you have any questions or comments?
I actually didn't have any questions or comments. I thought that the literature that we were provided was well-written and pretty clear in its meaning.
Commissioner Piketty?
My question is, can you clarify what our assignment is for this particular project? Are we looking to approve this to go on to the city council, or?
Sure. Sorry, I did not cover that, and I should have. What is before you is a proposal to amend 2 different chapters of the code. The first is Chapter 159, which is the zoning code. The amendment proposed to that chapter is simply to put in a reference in the provisions that speak to wireless provisions in general, the taller towers, for instance, and put in a reference that points to Chapter 98. And the reason we're not putting the small cell provisions in that chapter is because the legislation prohibited us from regulating this as a zoning matter. So that's the first amendment. The second amendment is where the meat is, and that is put in Chapter 98, which it actually speaks to the city's rights-of-way, which is most likely where these structures, where these facilities will be located. So based on the advice of the Illinois Municipal League and the city attorney, we're adding new sections to that chapter that speak directly to the small cell facilities. And what the commission's asked to do, because there's an amendment proposed to the zoning code, and because the city council passed a resolution asking the plan commission to hold the public hearing on this, which is the routine rather than the city council holding the public hearing, you're being asked to consider these amendments, open a public hearing. My expectation is probably no one will speak, and then forward a recommendation to the city council. The city council would then take official action based on your recommendation, but they would not then hold the formal public hearing. That is this body's job.
Thank you. Thank you.
Commissioner Burke?
I have a couple questions. The first thing I'll do is I'll pretend I'm somebody in the audience, and I'm going to bring up a question, and I'll say that I live on Western Avenue, approximately halfway between town and Wesley Road, and that I was surprised one morning when I looked out and saw a cell phone tower going up across the street where I didn't expect one to go up. And I know that that was probably not just done haphazardly, and now I'm speaking as myself, but I know that at the time or prior to that, just prior to that, we were working on the Barrow Woods development, and there was a cell phone tower that had to be put in because the chimney had been deftly construed so as to conceal the cell phone tower. It really looked convincing. I was fooled, and so we had to relocate after the building came down. And so I know there was probably a lot of considerations for that not to be seen from the development so much, and maybe the residential neighborhood over by South Park. But then it became rather obvious from Western Avenue. And I'm just wondering, I mean, these are numerous and varied, stipulations and requirements. I think it's great. But will these things ensure that we might not have something like that happen? I, for one, think that that was rather it's rather unfortunate that we see that on Western, because so many Lake Foresters travel into town and see that cell tower along that kind of bucolic railway plantings. Will this sort of help us to prevent that, or at least do what Commissioner Lay just referred to as giving everybody a chance to sound off, and also I'll piggyback a question that I have on that. Will any of these permitting processes require the petitioners to come in front of one of our boards? The great thing about these boards is that we have them, and they make the petitioners do their due diligence, and it also kind of prevents things from slipping through the cracks. I know at least someone will say, can we have you put a helium balloon and show us where that tower will be and how high it'll be, and can we go by on Tuesday afternoon between 3 and 6 and see it? And that way, at least everybody's got a chance to sort of, oh, I know what we're doing. This is what this is. I mean, are there any devices like that, Kathy, that could be put into this that can make us, make it more fail-safe, perhaps?
A couple different parts of your comments. What's proposed does not change the current wireless code provisions that are in the zoning code chapter. If someone wanted to install a new tower, that the current provisions regulate that. There are, can't remember, maybe 8 or 12 overlay districts within the city that identify areas where towers can go, how tall they can be, whether or not they require a special use permit. What is before you tonight doesn't change that at all. Will what's before you tonight give the city more leverage to push back harder on a proposed tower? I believe it will, because the small wireless facilities are permitted. The city cannot exclude them from a zoning perspective because of what the legislature did. So yes, if anybody came in for a tower, that would be governed through the standard procedures. And you're right, when Woodlands, when Old Main was demolished, that site was already part of an overlay district. The Plan Commission did have to do some amendments, and in fact, on numerous afternoons, we had, I think we had the fire department out there with their ladder, or maybe the forestry department. But there was quite a bit of due diligence that was done, and unfortunately, towers are ultimately seen from somewhere. That was determined to be the least impactful location. With respect to the small wireless facilities, the provisions in here do regulate to the extent possible. What this does is give us an opportunity to know what a provider is going to do, where they're going to put it, to have some opportunity to negotiate, push back. But no, there's no requirement for any of these facilities to go before a board or commission.
So it's a staff level?
Yes, and again, it's only, the review can only be within the narrow parameters within which municipalities were given to regulate these types of facilities.
So the purpose of the statute is to limit the municipality's ability to place burdens, additional burdens on the wireless companies if they want to use these small facilities. But I wasn't on the commission at the time that the Barrow one was reviewed, but I know there was a subcommittee that was formed of the Plan Commission. There was a great deal of work that was done on that. When I was on the commission here, we did look at some of those overlay districts and what that looked like, those provisions that are in the zoning code, chapter 159. And we did have somebody from the wireless companies who was here, a lobbyist on their behalf, and he was talking about it. And I think Kathy's right. I mean, while this does limit, Guy, the idea that we would have boards looking at these issues, by streamlining and making it easier for them to get access to these small facilities, we're increasing the likelihood that they won't need a tower. When we kept pushing back on that lobbyist and saying, well, what do you need a tower for? Why don't you put one up in the steeple of the church and then put one up in the fire department across the way? And right, for those of us that live in the Fourth Ward, like I do, where I lose my phone coverage regularly, we were saying, why can't you do something about that? And he said, it's such a brown zone or desert or whatever, that they needed something more powerful. Well, this would they'd have to get a series of permits, right? They'd have to put a number of these maybe along Everett Road or something like that, but they could do it without having to come here to this commission. And so in that sense, I think it's perhaps an opportunity for the city to get what we were trying to get at the last meeting from that group.
Because through the co-location, these small units will either be attached to existing towers or they'll have poles adjacent to the existing towers. That's the way I read this.
Or they will be put on existing utility poles.
Yes.
Or a utility pole could be put up. And you do see some of these. Along 41, you've seen some companies that have taken advantage of this in years past. But I think what we're seeing is with the technology, the equipment or the facilities are getting smaller, and you have that technological ability. There may be an additional investment, but as Commissioner Freeman said, I think it gives us a way to push back and say, you need a special use permit for that, but this, here's steps 1, 2, 3 to get there.
Right.
Well, I guess what I was leading up to is what we say at the bottom of page 7. It starts to refer to historic preservation requirements, and when we get into that, is that going to be just handled at the staff level, or does that become something that the Preservation Commission could get involved in? Or is that going to be something you reserve the right to decide on at the time?
The way it's written, it probably will be administrative. I think we probably felt like we were pushing the envelope a little bit to even call out historic districts, but we do have the ability to look at those areas a little bit more carefully. Again, not the ability to prohibit, but maybe the ability to say they need to be screened or shielded or located here, not there, at this height, not that height. But probably not something that would go before the Historic Preservation
The
Commission.
only reason I'm thinking that in some cases is I've seen over the years that I would imagine you'd feel this way too as a staff person. It must be a lot easier to deal with a petitioner when you can tell them that they're going to have to go in front of a board or a commission, and that they'll have to prepare a certain amount of information for them, and that the board members need to be satisfied, and not just staff only. It's kind of like the good cop, bad cop scenario, and that's what I was thinking about.
Certainly, if we got into a situation where something clearly objectionable was being proposed, we could make that suggestion. Again, probably if a wireless provider wanted to push back, because of the way the legislation was written, it was written to make these installations streamlined and easier.
But having said that, it says in the state statute that nothing in this paragraph may be construed to limit an authority's enforcement of historic preservation in conformance with the requirements adopted pursuant to Illinois State Agency Historic Resources Preservation Act. And then in the act, as you've proposed for our recommendation here to City Council, Section I that you point to here, Guy, also repeats that language, saying that it cannot be construed to limit the city's enforcement of the historic preservation. So I think there's opportunities there where you could, arguably under that, at least the way I read it, and consistent with that, and we'd have to ask the city attorney, of course, but my expectation would be that you might get a few of these that have to go before
I'm just trying to
historic
like
preservation.
front-end load it so it doesn't become something that's, well, you can't do that because you didn't state it. It might be that someone's going to say, well, the Deer Path Inn would be a really great building to blah, blah, blah this on, or something. And not that the people that own it now would do that, but someone else. And in here, it says you can't put a new tower up 2 football fields from the next big tower. So that's 600 feet. Then if you're into downtown Lake Forest, that means you're going to have to go on top of buildings. And a lot of our buildings are historic. And I would just think it might be, is there any way you could actually insert language that would give you that option, so it doesn't look like you're inventing it at the counter when somebody comes in with their attorney and another attorney and another attorney, and you could say, well, this falls into this category here where you'll have to appear before a commission.
As Commissioner Freeman identified, that there's that opportunity. I think the intent is that we would work with wireless providers to achieve a rollout that really balances the interests of our historic district, the need for people to have streamlined services. This doesn't prohibit us from forwarding something to the Historic Preservation Commission, and I think if it was something that was objectionable, or located in a very sensitive area, we could certainly do that. This provision, again, doesn't allow a new tower. It has limits on, a new tower would still be governed by the existing code provisions.
That was basically what I wanted to get across.
Thank you. Commissioner Freeman?
Yes, so Kathy, I'm looking at page 5 of your submission. It's section or chapter 98, 132 B1B. And the title is Public Safety Space Reservation. And I would just make a suggestion that perhaps we delete public safety from that header. I think it's a little confusing because the language that is taken from this is taken from section 15, subparagraph D1 of the actual act. And what it allows for is space reservation, not only for public safety reasons, but for the city's electric utility uses. And so I think when you have a paragraph that has a header that's limited to one, when actually it's supposed to be broader than that, it's a little confusing. The language within it, I think, is fine, because it does reference both the city and the public safety uses. But I would just make that for, maybe the city attorney could just take a look at that, and that was all I had.
Commissioner Atkinson?
Well, I have a few questions on this for you, Kathy. I know we are limited on what we can do, but I share Guy's concern about the historic districts. And I guess what I'm trying to figure out is what do I expect to see? So do we have any pictures of what these look like? I have no idea what these boxes look like.
I don't have any pictures. We do have some throughout the community currently. And again, they tend to take the shape of antennas or boxes on utility poles most often,
On existing?
on
Utility
existing
poles.
utility poles.
Okay.
The provision that would allow the facilities on non-residential uses, commercial and industrial, would apply to a portion of the central business district. But again, if there was something significant proposed, for instance, on Market Square, there would be justification, I think, to bring it forward to the Historic Preservation Commission.
Yeah, that's would be my concern, because I'm thinking about certain areas where there are no poles. You know, wires are underground. So does that mean these providers can put up a pole in an area where we have no overhead wires?
No. Page 5, subparagraph F. No new utility poles or wireless support structures may be installed in a right-of-way in violation of any undergrounding requirements.
So then how do they do that if everything's underground?
They'd have to find another location, I mean, based
Use
on
an
what.
existing pole.
Yeah, they'd have
But
to
if there's
find,
no poles,
if there aren't, and then there aren't existing poles because of that requirement, well, then they have to abide by that.
is that true? Do they would put it on a building then?
In a non-residential area,
Like
again,
Market
this is really to infill in areas where we have current gaps or where there's an increased need just because of the increased data use. I think if there was not interference with existing underground utilities, theoretically, a new pole could be installed with a height limit. But again, it's something that, without these provisions, it can be done after August 1st.
So that concerns me if we're in Market Square or we're in an area, a historic area where we have worked so hard to preserve that historic vista, and there's no overhead poles, and then they come along and they can put up a pole. So in that instance, would you recommend they go before the HPC?
Certainly, if there was something that was truly out of character, for instance, something in Market Square, I think that's an easy decision. In our discussions to date, I don't expect that our discussions with wireless providers are going to change significantly. We've had many discussions over the years about the central business district, and unfortunately, we have some pretty unsightly on the 580 Bank Lane building and then 191 Deer Path. Those are there because we've always said no in Market Square. So I don't see this as a wholesale opening the door. I think what this does is actually gives the city more protection, the ability to know what's going on before it happens, the ability to review, question, and present some challenges if appropriate.
And when you say right-of-way, that means the parkways, essentially.
Correct. Where our utility poles are.
Or, which also could mean the backyard of some people, because that's where utility poles are too. So is someone gonna look out their back door and see someone climbing up a utility pole in their backyard and putting one of these?
That's residential.
Public right-of-way is normally streets. We do have a couple alleys in the community. But in areas where there is just a ComEd right-of-way or a ComEd easement, that is not necessarily a right-of-way, a city right-of-way.
Because I have, you know, in our neighborhood, the poles are in the back of our yards. And so just thinking, you know, sometimes I look at my backyard and there's a guy up on the pole and I don't know what he's doing up there. So are they gonna be doing the same thing, putting these boxes on some of those poles in people's backyards?
ComEd has already approved some small cell installations on poles over the years. So we currently have some of those if you go around the community. So ComEd, I think a number of years back, they were more open to that. I think they found some perhaps interference issues or some maintenance issues, but for some reason ComEd seemed to back off of that. But yes, ComEd has already allowed some of those partnerships.
And do you know, do these make noise? Do they hum or anything, or are they silent?
To my knowledge, they don't make noise. I've been around some that have been installed. I have not noticed that.
Okay. I'm just wondering what to expect, you know, when, you know, I mean, I know we don't really have a lot of say in what we're approving here, but I just want to understand what we're going to be expecting here. And that's going to be great because I don't get any cell phone coverage in my yard, so, so it'll be nice to have. And I also noticed there's two different, there's a micro and then there's a small wireless. So what's the difference between the two and when would either one be used?
Size is the difference. Technologically, I can't tell you when one is used and when the other is used, but it's simply a difference in size. Again, I don't think the wireless providers are necessarily going to be rushing in to do this. This is an investment for them. This is rolling out a different type of a system, costs money, and I think, as we've talked about some different areas in the past, that's why there's always been that pushback.
Okay. Let's see. I noticed on page 6, I don't know, it might be a typo. Let's see, it was under item J on page 6, under public safety. And it says federal, state, and local codes are other laws that concern public safety. Is that correct? Is it are or?
That probably is a typo.
It's supposed to be and, maybe?
I would suggest that
I
that
just saw
should
that
be
one.
and.
Tells you what I
Yes.
was doing today. So, let's see, okay. I think you've answered a lot of these. So I also noticed that the pole can be 10 feet to 45 feet tall. Is that correct?
I believe the antenna can be 10 feet above an existing utility pole, or a new pole can be up to 45 feet.
So that's pretty tall.
The higher of the two is the max.
45 feet above ground level.
So you're definitely going to see that from others.
Yeah, I mean, regrettably, the state legislature has passed this legislation, and so and it is intended to limit
the city's ability to
Regulate that.
regulate it.
Yeah,
And
'cause that's
so
tough.
it's, I think what we're trying to do here is just allow the city to start charging for permits and get it through a process where we can do the best we can to mitigate any risk that's created by what the state legislature has decided to dictate to us what we can do.
Mm-hmm.
So there's really nothing we can do about height, basically, that's,
Not with respect to the height. Again, I think the flip side of that, this does limit our ability, but on the other side, I think it does give us stronger negotiating power.
Sure. It's like having a lot of really inefficient locks on your door. The guys are gonna get them open, but the longer they have to go at it, the more likely they are to give up or, and it's just nice to have this. I mean, they walk in and they know they have to try to be at least somewhat, congenial with the community. And
Right. 'cause
I mean,
if we
I'm in
don't have a
favor of,
permitting-
I'm in favor of all of it. I just thought I'd try to make it a little bit more difficult for some of those issues that may pop up where we'll go, oh, boy, how did that happen? We should have had somebody, make them go through a couple more hoops, because I've just noticed that about the boards when in the outside community, I occasionally have met people that are in the process of going through, and just the fact that we have boards and citizens that are on the boards, it just seems like that open forum presentation that a petitioner has to go through makes them go a little further than if they just maybe think they can sweet talk in private and in an administrative way. I just think that, and it helps staff out too. It must make it immensely easier for you guys to have backup, in the public forum. But
Well, my understanding is the legislature took this action specifically to,
Prevent
again,
this.
streamline the process and allow wireless facilities to be built out without going through boards, commissions, zone changes, special use permits. So
But they did add
didn't
something-
touch the towers, but these smaller facilities.
but I did read something about unless there's a variance requested. So what kind of variance would they be asking for, height?
Certainly, they could ask for a height variance to be
Okay.
taller than what's specified, and then that would trigger a variance process. That would go to the zoning board of appeals.
So, and the other thing is, so I read, I think I read that we can charge them $200 per pole, is that right? Did I read that in here, that said we can charge them?
The city council will be looking concurrently with this to establish fees. Whether, I think the 200 came from the Illinois Municipal League, but the city council will be looking at permit fees, they'll be looking at, rental isn't the right word, but a fee to actually use our utility poles, so they will be looking at a series of fees that would go along with these requests.
Okay,
The 200 was an upward limit of the annual amount that a municipality could charge for co-locating.
right, so
that
200 is not a fee, but we can still charge them a fee, which is
right.
good. And this kind of piggybacks on Guy's question, so can we revise our ordinance in the future if we see there's certain things that we are not covering or items we don't like? Of course, it's within the context of the state legislature's act, but can we revise the ordinance in the future?
If we see that there are gaps, we would have to then work with the city attorney to determine whether the municipality, whether the city has the ability within the limits established by the act to make specific changes. Again, this ordinance was developed by the Illinois Municipal League, working with probably 20 different municipalities, really trying to take advantage of any authorizations given within that act. Doesn't mean the act couldn't change in the future, either to our benefit or in the other direction.
Yeah, depending if we see things that apply to us specifically that we want to adjust. So will you be, I don't know, so neighbors won't have, they won't be noticed when these things are installed, they'll just happen, right? And so what recourse, if there's something goes wrong, with the installation or neighbors are upset about something, what recourse do they have? Who do they contact about it?
Certainly, they can contact the city.
I was gonna say, you're looking at her.
If something is installed that is not in accordance with the approved plans and the permit that was issued, then we have an issue. If something was installed in accordance with the ordinance, in accordance with the approved plans, in accordance with the permit, then I think the discussion is more difficult. But, you know, certainly now we have, you know, people who are not happy with something that's built, that's in accordance with the ordinance and in accordance with the permits, and we just have to have that discussion.
I'm just thinking of the tree butchers that come around every now and then with the wires, and like, they just do whatever they want, and neighbors need a recourse, you know? So I'm wondering if it's the same kind of situation where they just put up their boxes and don't really care about the neighbors too much, so.
Well, with these provisions in place, they would need to bring in plans, they would need to get permits, and we would follow up with an inspection. So we would be monitoring that work.
Okay.
And there's an ongoing duty to maintain, and they can have the permit revoked, and there are definitely safeguards in there.
And removal if the facilities are no longer used.
Right.
Okay.
But I do think, if I could just add, I think both the comments that Susan and Guy have raised, and I would encourage you, Kathy, to work with the city attorney, and hopefully this won't come up, but were it to come up, I do think, in my reading of the statute and the revisions that the city has proposed here, there's still an opportunity in historic districts to make sure that they follow our process and that they come before the historic preservation committee if that's what's required. So I think that's definitely worth looking at. I wouldn't rule that out.
Okay, we will look at that language and see if there's the ability to make it clear. I think the current language allows that, but we'll see if we can specify that a little bit clearer.
I agree. I think that's in the historic districts. I think they have to, there's a certain heightened expectation of these providers to be a little bit more sensitive to.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about, Kathy, with regard to your, if you wanted to direct one of those petitioners to go to the commission, if there was some verbiage in here that was a little bit more explicit, that would make it easier for you, rather than say, hey, I think you guys might I think you might have to go to the commission. They're gonna think you're just whipping this up off the top of your head. If there's something in here that actually prepares for that, you could say, oh, this is gonna fall into this particular requirement when there's, blah, blah, blah. I'm just
Yeah, I
thinking
didn't mean
it-
to suggest that, Guy, because I think you're kind of stuck with the language that's in the state statute. I just think the language in the state statute is broad enough.
Well, but we're not changing the state statute. Isn't this something
No,
that's
we're-
just
Well-
recommended by the Illinois Municipal League as additional?
No, the states,
No.
we're required, we're limited now under the state statute to, what we're really doing is creating a permitting process and the authority for the city to move forward with, in the restricted format that the state legislature has now mandated. So,
Right, and
really-
it does say about home rule, a home rule unit may not regulate small wireless facilities in a manner inconsistent with this act.
Well,
then there's some
isn't this stuff
qualifying
called
language.
proposed amendment? I mean, if it's a
Yeah.
proposed
Those
amendment.
are our amendments.
But
Yeah,
if we do
yeah,
nothing,
that's-
Guy, so
but I'm-
that's what I'm saying, all we're doing is we're establishing a permitting process, because if we do nothing, they can just start building them.
Right.
No, I know that. I just, since this is our proposed amendment, I meant, can we put something in this historic districts and landmark paragraph that makes it a little easier for you to require them to go to a commission?
Not if it's inconsistent with the state statute is the problem.
But I don't know that it is inconsistent, because if you read the state or you read it, it sounded like they're directing it to our particular local historic district commission's prerogatives or requirements, right?
I think that'll be, like many
know
things,
that-
many things when legislation changes, that'll be litigated at some point perhaps.
Well,
but-
everything's contentious,
what
but
it-
if
what
we
it's-
at least prepare for it, then at least Kathy doesn't have to arm wrestle the guy at the counter to
We
do
can
it.
certainly talk with the city attorney and see if there's any room
Right.
to change that language, but
Right.
we
But I
don't
think even
wanna,
with the language as written, I'm suggesting even with the language as it's written, which is consistent with the state statute, I think there's an opening there for discussion about how we execute against the expectations of a historic preservation district. So I think we can accomplish what you're hoping to accomplish, Guy, without having to potentially create a amendment that is inconsistent with the state
No,
legislation.
I just thought I'd bring it up. I mean, that's the beauty of the city council sending this to us, because we're gonna nitpick this thing to pieces,
We're
and-
supposed to.
And that's what we're supposed to do. And that way, when it goes to the city council, they're gonna, I mean, you put some of this in the minutes that we had a little bit of a discussion about some specifics that, they're gonna come up someday. I know they will, because a number of times on these commissions and boards that I've been on, I don't know how many times I've kicked myself. I said, why didn't I open my big mouth about that or this? Because the chicken always comes home to roost. It will always come home to roost.
Well, that's why I'm asking what they're going to look like, because I don't want to be surprised thinking we approved this, and then there's this monstrosity up there, and I'm like, is that what we approved? Because I've also noticed in here they can hang the micro units on the wires between the poles, right? So that's kind of like, that'll be unexpected.
And our expectation is that exactly what these look like is going to continue to evolve.
Yeah.
And hopefully
Because
they
the
get smaller and
technology
smaller.
does.
Get more
evolve.
efficient.
So they are limited by size specifically, but not
Where's
necessarily.
a couple of examples of really nicely done concealments? Are there some that are outstanding that you can think of off the top of your head around town?
Most of these are boxes that are hung or affixed to the top of, I mean, they're not artful installations. That just isn't,
Do they have to be somewhat line of sight in order for the cell phones to work? I mean, you can't put them over the parapet wall of a building and hide them, right? Do they have to be up and exposed to a certain extent to be functioning at optimal capacity?
No, they bury them in towers all the time.
No, but I mean, well, that's
Well,
true,
yeah,
they do
instead
You're
that.
gonna hide them
But
like
some
in
of
the
them have,
historic
I mean, the
district.
ones at Barra, and these would be older devices, but that extended chimney chase was fiberglass. And I think I understand it was supposed to allow the waves to go through better than if it was masonry, brick or something like that,
Yeah, that would be great if we could guide them in that way in the historic district.
whatever.
Be a little bit artful in their camouflage. Because there's also something that says ground-based enclosures for the equipment, so they can be on the ground too, right?
supporting equipment can be on the ground, again, like you have with transformers or AT&T boxes, you have mechanical ground equipment. We do have
It's already
landscape screening requirements that sometimes we have better luck with than others, but yes, we do have a lot of mechanical equipment around us to support how we live.
Right.
Right.
It's a reality.
Would we require that for the ground-based, I mean, would the city ordinances for landscaping for ground-based equipment apply to this too?
We have the ability to require landscaping to
Okay.
some extent, yes.
That's good, okay.
You know,
oh,
just one more thought on the historic preservation stuff. A petitioner going to a community, say Glencoe, where they have the other type of preservation ordinance that's weaker than ours, right? I mean, we have a preservation ordinance has some state-based statutes that was adopted, and there are a number of other communities that don't have that one. They have the one, we'd like you to do this, but it doesn't have any backup. So petitioners that would be, wireless petitioners that would be going to those communities, and they would be somewhat accustomed to say, trying to meet the requirements of that, then come to Lake Forest where it's a little bit meatier. I mean, they're gonna be prepared somehow to maybe meet a little more stiffer requirements than
Some communities may not adopt
this at all, right?
administrative provisions at all.
Mm-hmm.
So we are taking that step to assure that we know
Good.
what and when and
Yep.
how, and that we do have the ability to have those discussions.
Well, and it certainly seems that, having skimmed the actual Public Act, but thoroughly read what the city's proposing, is that the attorney followed almost point by point what was allowed in the Public Act for the city to do. One question I had was, after 1 year of disuse, these boxes are supposed to come down. Now, how do you know when they stop using them?
We would have to establish some kind of reporting process when we issue a permit.
Okay.
Or if
And-
you're paying a fee, presumably you'll know, because they'll stop paying the fee.
Yeah.
Well, but is there an annual fee or simply installation fees?
There can be an annual fee.
Oh, that's
Okay.
good.
They also talk about consolidated co-location applications. What kinds of providers will be requesting these, and do you have any idea of how many requests might be made?
Again, my sense is we are not going to see a lot of these. We've seen providers really consolidate. There used to be numerous providers. Now we more often see kind of a a facility service that comes in for these kinds of permits that may be working for one or more wireless providers. I don't think we probably see more than one or two at the very top end, 3 providers in this, serving this community currently. I think our issue has often been the other direction. As providers look at our community, they don't want to build facilities where half of their service area is out in the lake, because they're not generating revenue. So we've had actually trouble from the other perspective getting adequate coverage.
Right.
Well, and I just wanted to point out, for those who might not be reading this, that at home, that micro wireless facility is no larger in dimension than 24 inches in length, 15 inches in width, and 12 inches in height, with an exterior antenna no longer than 11 inches. They're quite small to begin with. I had one other question on some language in the act referred to Lake County,
Oh, yeah. I was on-
the Lake County pilot project. Do you have any information on that, Kathy?
I don't.
Okay.
I can certainly see if I can find something out and get back to you.
I found a few typos or extra words, and I can leave this with you. I just marked them. Any other questions from the commissioners? Kathy, any final points you'd like to make?
Nope.
So at this stage, should we proceed to consider action on adopting these 2 amendments so that the city council can discuss it on Monday?
Chair, entertain a motion on that?
Yes, we would.
I would recommend that the city council, we recommend that this commission recommend to city council the amendments of chapter 159 and chapter 98 as outlined in the staff submission, with, again, a review by city council, perhaps Kathy, as to section 132B 1B and 132B 1L, B being the public safety issue and L being the historic preservation aspect. And then, of course, subject to any other typos that Commissioner Carey will leave with you as well.
Is it possible to put a condition on there also to request that we revisit the ordinance in a certain amount of time just to evaluate its effectiveness or its, I'm just thinking, can we bring it back at some time once it's implemented, just to look at
Should
it,
we hear a second before we hear amendments?
our conditions?
I'll second the
Okay.
proposed.
Sorry.
Commissioner Atkinson?
I'm just thinking in terms of conditions, can we add that? Would it be necessary?
Certainly you can add it. Maybe what you want to request is a report after 12 months on how many permits have been issued or how many installation sites have been implemented, if that's something you want to do.
And maybe the impact on the historic district, also, the installations, because that seems to be our big concern, is just.
Yeah, I think that's a good friendly amendment as a recommendation to the council that they consider 1 year post-passage, some review of the permitting process and the issues. I think that's it.
Maintaining our historic visual character.
Kathy, you may be the one that wants that to happen more than anybody, in case there's a lot of, rebuttal or calls from neighbors and things that are upset with what's going on, and so it could be beneficial.
So then the amendment,
Accepted.
okay. Then, any comments before taking a vote? Anyone wish to comment on the motion that's on the floor? Okay, Commissioner Freeman's amendment, his motion with amendment attached is now put to a vote. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? The motion is carried. We're now at a time in the meeting for an opportunity for the public to address the Plan Commission on matters not on the agenda. Seeing no issues raised, is there any other information from staff?
I just want to note for the record that in the item that you just completed, there was no public testimony. So I will make sure the minutes reflect that the public hearing was open, there was no testimony, and it was closed. Just to keep that clean.
Thank you.
No, nothing else.
Because that's why it was sent here instead of to the legal committee, because the legal committee can't have an open hearing, right? So that
Exactly,
was the
yes.
idea. That's what I figured.
Well, they also want our interests and
Oh, well, that too,
commentary.
of course, they're dying to hear from us, but I knew there was a reason it came here instead of the legal committee, because it does seem like a wonky kind of thing, so.
It's, you know,
And
from-
yet, a very interesting discussion. So,
visual.
seeing no further business, the Plan Commission meeting is now adjourned.
1 hour.
That was a good,
That was a good discussion with you.